they all include mysteries and crimes in their stories. I think because crimes often tell us a lot about society. And so to begin to understand society and human nature, it's a good starting point to look at crime and why people commit crime.
So he must be a crime fiction writer because he also has detectives in the very beginning of the police force. And Inspector Bucket is an interesting character and keeps running all through the book.
Yes, Dickens was one of the first English novelists to use a police detective in his books, and he did it, I think, fairly realistically. And also his character Bucket, terrible name, just a joke of a name, but he's a very good detective, and he's very much like Sherlock Holmes in that he can deduce a lot of information from examining the world around him, and he's persistent. And so he has some of the characteristics that would go on to become very common among detectives, including Poirot. There's something in Poirot, Agatha Christie's detective. There's something of Inspector Bucket. And definitely there's quite a lot of Sherlock Holmes. The fact that Sherlock Holmes likes to disguise himself, and Inspector Bucket also does that. He's partially based, I think, Bucket on a real French detective called Vidocq, who had been a detective in Paris but had also been a criminal. And he would disguise himself for days on end to study a criminal or to trap a criminal. And Vidocq had written about his adventures, and his book had been very successful in England. And there's no doubt that Dickens probably knew that story. And, you know, when I started writing crime fiction, I didn't read much crime fiction. I didn't read Agatha Christie or Conan Doyle, but I had read Dickens. And so to me, writing about a detective was still a form of literature. It wasn't a lesser form of writing just because it had a detective in it. And writers like Charles Dickens made it acceptable to me to write crime fiction as opposed to what's called literary fiction.
Yeah. But there's another detective that we all know, and of course it's Sherlock Holmes, as you mentioned, and it was created by an Edinburgh man, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Edinburgh man, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he's perhaps the most known detective, most famous detective in the world, and almost a real character. People treat him as a real character. Doyle credited the conception of Holmes to his teacher of medical school of Edinburgh University, Dr. Joseph Bell. What was the effect of Holmes on crime fiction writers and their detectives, and also of Dr. Watson on narrators? Because we do meet narrators in many books of crime fiction.
Yes, it's always been slightly frustrating, I think, speaking as a Scottish writer, that Conan Doyle is not regarded as a Scottish novelist because he chose to set his books in London. and he became very much associated with London. And something similar happened with Robert Louis Stevenson, whose most famous book, perhaps, Jekyll and Hyde, Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde, about well, partly based on a real Edinburgh character, was set in London. And so both of these novelists became associated with London more than Edinburgh, but Edinburgh had a huge influence on them. And they were both living in Edinburgh at a time when Edinburgh was a city of great discoveries, scientific discoveries, and philosophical inquiries. And so the city had a huge effect on both of them. And they both used real characters or real incidents as the basis for their most famous characters or their most famous books. And Doyle was influenced by his teachers at Edinburgh University. They'd be studying anatomy, and Joseph Bell would look at a body and could tell by looking at the body, could give you lots of information about the life that that person had led. And what you then got in English crime fiction was the rational detective, the detective who uses science and deduction to solve the crime. And these crimes often happen in a particular level of society. It's not really the poor and the dispossessed and the working class. It's often the rich people. The rich people in the middle class are the victims in these crimes. And again, that's quite frustrating, because I think crime fiction is at its best often when it's dealing with the lower classes, the lower levels of society, and explaining what drives people to commit crime. And often it's envy and greed, but it's also need. It's the fact that people, look around them at a world that they feel is passing them by, and they are not allowed to be part of, and they want some of that. They want money, they want influence, they want power, and crime seems to them the only way that they can get that they can aspire to these things. So yeah, for a long time in English crime fiction, you had this quite narrow band of society that was being written about. And it took a long time, really, before crime writers in the UK and the United Kingdom began to use their detectives to explore society more widely, get a much more broad look at society, from the people at the very top to the people at the very bottom.
What about Dr. Watson and narration? The narrator.
Well, Dr. Watson is important because he is the voice of the reader. You need a sidekick. You need someone who is there to ask the question the reader wants to have answered, which is, my God, Sherlock Holmes, how could you possibly have worked that out? How could you possibly deduct that that person is the killer? Well, Dr. Watson, I'll tell you. So you need the sidekick to play that role. And often in crime fiction, the main detective has the sidekick, whether it's Poirot or whether it's Holmes or even Rebus. Often the detective needs a sidekick, someone who they can bounce ideas off and who can also ask them the questions the reader needs to have answered. Often, however, the sidekick, I'm afraid, because they are on the page next to a larger than life character, they almost become invisible. Their role becomes very much secondary, because if you've got a Poirot or a Holmes or a Rebus, these are very big characters, and often the reader is so interested in them that they don't give much attention to the sidekick, which can be very frustrating. It's been frustrating for me until recently that Rebus's sidekick, Siobhan Clarke, seems almost to disappear when Rebus is on the page, because he is such a large character. He's so three-dimensional. that for the reader she almost ceases to have interest. And this is a problem with the sidekick, is that the reader just isn't as interested in them and never can be as interested in them as they are in the main character.
Yes, but they do have the reader. Uh, they don't understand things we don't understand either. So they ask the detective, and that's how we learn.
Yes, they're important. I used to think that in my early novels with Inspector Rebus, he has a sidekick whose name actually is Holmes. There's a detective called Brian Holmes, named in honor of Sherlock Holmes. And he is there to fulfill that function, to fulfill that role of asking the questions the reader needs answered. And then I thought, well, does Rebus really need that? Would the character, Rebus psychologically is a loner. He's much more like an American private detective in the way that he investigates a crime. And so would he need a sidekick necessarily? And it's a thing that you don't get in the American crime novel to the same extent. The American crime novel very much involves private detectives rather than police detectives, the classical American crime
Yeah.
novel. And so they don't have these sidekicks. They have these maverick, loner, existential heroes. And when I created Rebus, he was much more that kind of character. So eventually, Brian Holmes disappears from the series and Rebus is on his own. And then I thought, well, actually, it's quite fun if there's someone else there to be with him when he's doing his detecting. And so Siobhan Clarke was introduced. And she's much more like me than Rebus is. Rebus isn't like me at all. So it's almost like I am there walking with Rebus and studying him, learning from him, but also sometimes having to say to him, your way of looking at the world isn't necessarily correct. Rebus sees the world in terms of black and white, in terms of good and evil. He sees the world in absolutes. And Siobhan Clarke's role is to say to him sometimes, the world is more complex than that. There are more nuances than you are allowing for. And maybe you should think about that a little bit. So, for example, in Rebus's world, once you are a villain, you're always a villain, or you're always going to be under suspicion. And Siobhan allows the reader to say to Rebus, come on, people can change. People don't necessarily need to be criminals all their lives. People evolve, and you must allow them to allow that to happen.
And she's a very polished, very up in her own right.
She's a good character, and I would like to find a story one day that is a story where she is the main character. It just hasn't happened yet. I get a theme that I want to talk about. I get a crime that allows me to look at that theme. And then I ask myself, what character is the best character to tell this story? And so far, the answer has almost always been John Rebus. It's not been Siobhan Clarke, but that might change in the future. In my latest book, half the book is a story that Siobhan and her colleague Malcolm Fox are involved in, and it doesn't feature Rebus at all. So it's a chance for them to show that they are interesting characters, characters the reader wants to spend time with, and they are just as good a detective in their different ways from Rebus. Rebus is a bit of a dinosaur now. He's old. His way of doing things doesn't necessarily work in the contemporary world. But he's still a very interesting character to be around. So I get to have both. I get to have the old-fashioned detective, the way they went about it in the 70s and 80s, and the modern detective who uses technology that Rebus doesn't understand and doesn't trust. And this, of course, wasn't available to the Golden Age detectives, the Philip Marlowes, the Sherlock Holmes, the Poirot, the Miss Marple. They used their instinct their human intelligence was what solved the crime. And often in those books, whether it's Poirot or Sherlock Holmes or Miss Marple or Raymond Chandler's Marlowe, the police detective is not good at being a detective. They are often they look in the wrong direction, and it's
Yeah.
the private detective or the amateur detective or the consulting detective who solves the crime. And again, I've found that when I came to crime fiction, I found that quite unrealistic. So I decided that my detectives would always be professional police detectives, because in the real world, that is who is going to solve the crime. Miss Marple is not going to solve the crime in an urban contemporary setting. Sherlock Holmes is not going to be allowed access to a police investigation in a contemporary setting. So Rebus had to come along. Although he operates almost like a private detective, he has been mostly a member of a contemporary police force.
Yes.
And that means that there are rules that need to be followed, but it also means that he has the power he needs. I mean, if he's got a police badge, an ID, he can get access to the people at the very top of society and the people at the very bottom of society, and none of them can refuse to speak to him and answer his questions.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, what I am curious about is what is the difference between British English crime fiction and that of other cultures? What is this difference? Because
Well,
they were.
there are big differences. How long have you got, Seven? How long have you got? Well, I mean, the English crime novel and the Scottish crime novel come from very different places. There hasn't really been a tradition of crime fiction from Scotland. The appearance of Sherlock Holmes did not lead to lots of Scottish crime fiction being written. And we had to wait really to be influenced by the American crime novel. So the Scottish crime novel tends to be more urban and gritty than the classical English detective story. And we were also influenced by movies and by TV, which
Yeah,
again was more gritty and more urban. Um, but because there was no Miss Marple, because there was no Hercule Poirot in Scottish crime fiction, Scottish writers had a freedom to do whatever they wanted. So if you look at contemporary Scottish crime fiction, you will find cozy novels more like Agatha Christie. You'll find urban, gritty thrillers. You'll find psychological novels. You'll find books set in historical periods, set in the past. You'll even find books set in the future. Um, so it's a very broad field, the Scottish crime novel. It contains everything. Um, but I think a lot of us were influenced not so much by Miss Marple and Poirot, but by the Scottish literature of the past. So it was books like Dr. Jekyll and Mr Hyde. And another very important book was this one here, which was an influence on Jekyll and Hyde, which is called, can you see that? Put it there. So it's Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner.
yeah, yeah.
A writer
They
called
felt.
James Hogg. And it's one of the very first serial killer novels in history, where a young religious zealot, a young Christian man, meets a charismatic stranger who convinces him that because he is going to go to heaven, he can do whatever he wants on earth, up to and including killing his own brother. Now, we're never sure as readers whether this charismatic stranger really exists, or is he a figment of the imagination? So is it basically Jekyll and Hyde? Is it a kind of version of Jekyll and Hyde? It's a book about why good people do bad things. And all crime fiction comes from that very basic question, no matter which culture it's written in. Why do people do terrible things, specifically to each other. Jekyll and Hyde, you can boil down to that. Justified Sinner boils down to that. All of my novels boil down to that. But at the same time, what we found in Scotland and elsewhere in the UK is that the crime novel is great at looking at society. So if I want to learn about a culture, if I want to learn about Turkey, I will go to the crime fiction that has been written in Turkey and about Turkey, because I will learn about the cities, the politics, what social problems you have. I'll also learn about the food and the drink. And you're learning about the culture, you're learning about the people, their aspirations, what they're scared of, what their yearnings are, and all of that you can take from the crime novel. So the detective novel is the perfect way of immersing yourself very quickly in a culture or a society. And when I learned that early on in my writing career, I decided that I would always write crime fiction because I wanted to look at Scotland, I wanted to look at Edinburgh from top to bottom, and then use Edinburgh as a microcosm for things that were happening in other countries and other cultures. So you'll find that the crime fiction that's being written now will be exploring things that its contemporary audience are worried about or scared of. So it could be people trafficking, drugs, prostitution, political turmoil. It could be, yeah, all of these things are explored in contemporary crime fiction, and also the technology. So although we all love using the internet, we're also terrified that the internet can steal our identity. And so the crime novel now deals with identity theft over the internet, stalking on the internet, chat rooms where you give away too much information about yourself. All of these things are being written about. People are starting to write crime novels that look like blogs, or that deal with the people who are being stalked through blogs or giving too much information away. So the crime novel for me, it's the perfect box in which to explore the world.
So, yeah, I know, and you know your city very well. You know Edinburgh very well, and you can use the city. When I first made an interview with you, I hadn't seen Edinburgh, but I loved Rivers all the same. Then I went to Edinburgh for 2 days only. But when I saw the city, tried to find the places that, Rivers went. Uh, and you have something in the atmosphere of the city or something about the city that makes you understand the books better. Your books, Rivers' books, mostly in Edinburgh there. Uh, and knowing the city, even for a short time, made me understand the books better because you use that city in your books.
Well, yeah, I'm glad to hear that. I do use the real city as much as I can to persuade the reader that they are not reading fiction, that they are maybe involved in a story that could be real. I often say that my novels are not about things that have happened, but they're about things that could happen realistically in Edinburgh, in Scotland. And yeah, I mean, every city has a side that the tourist sees, a side that the visitor sees, but there's another side to the city that I can explore that maybe the tourist doesn't see. The kinds of crime that exist, the poverty, the problems with drugs and unemployment, with immigration, all these things, political turmoil, all of this can be explored through a crime story. And all cities are Jekyll and Hyde cities. So, for example, when I visited Istanbul, I've only visited Istanbul once, and it was only for, I think, 3 days. Of course, I only saw the surface. I only saw Hagia Sophia and walked around the main streets and saw the tourist areas. But I was very aware there was another Turkey and another Istanbul that I was not going to be privileged to see unless I read the literature. And if I began to read the books, then I would maybe get a deeper understanding of the city. But all cities are Jekyll and Hyde cities. They have the surface and they have what's lurking beneath the surface. Edinburgh has it in a structural form because there are two parts of Edinburgh. We call it the Old Town and the New Town. And the Old Town was chaotic. It's the original city, and it was built in a very chaotic fashion. Then there was the New Town that started to be built in the late 18th century, early 19th century, and it was built to be rational and planned. So if you look at a street map of Edinburgh and you look at the New Town and the Old Town, one of them has a rational, pleasing geometric shape. That's the New Town. And one of them is kind of chaotic, and that's the Old Town. Robert Louis Stevenson, the author of Jekyll and Hyde, lived in the New Town. But as a young man, he was attracted to the Old Town because the Old Town was where all the interesting people were. The drug addicts, the drunks, the prostitutes, the criminals, the poets, the singers, everybody else would all go to the bars of the Old Town. So Stevenson moved between these two cities, the rational and the irrational, the planned and the unplanned, the chaotic, the Jekyll and the Hyde. And that, for me, when I was reading these books, that made me think Edinburgh is the perfect city to set crime fiction, because in its planning, in its shape, it is a town, a city of good and evil, planned and unplanned, rational and chaotic. But all cities have got it. They've all got that hidden side that crime fiction looks at. The American crime model was an influence on me because I wanted to write urban fiction. I wanted to write about a city. And the English traditional crime novel very much takes place in the village. It takes place in an idealized version of England. And in this idealized pastoral version of England, murder happens, so chaos arrives, but the rational detective, who's usually from the middle or upper classes, will solve the crime using their intellect. Now, often in real life, that isn't the case. It's a team of detectives, and they might not be using their intellect. They might be using threats, say, as might happen in the American crime novel, or technology to help them solve the case, as happens in the contemporary crime novel. So when I looked at the English crime novel, I didn't see much there to attract me as a writer. But when I looked at the American crime novel, which was darker, full of maverick detectives who didn't obey the rules, more violent and more urban, I thought this is more the kind of book I want to write. So although Rebus, I decided, had to be a police detective because I didn't find the private detective very realistic in a British setting, that he would work almost as a private detective within the police force. So it was Chandler. Raymond Chandler's Marlowe was a huge influence on me. And the contemporary fiction of people like James Ellroy, setting his books in Los Angeles, but often with real life characters in them, real gangsters and real incidents in history. And that became a big influence on me.
What about the Scandinavian crime fiction?
Well, the Scandinavians came along later, really. I didn't read the Martin Beck novels of Per Waller and Maj Scherval until quite late, but they're terrific novels. They wrote 10 novels about Swedish society in the 1960s and 1970s, and using the crime novel. They were Marxists. They were in their political life. They were a Marxist husband and wife, and they were using the crime novel to look at how they felt Swedish society was changing for the worse. So that was interesting, but they came along later. I didn't read them in the early days. And the Scandinavian crime novel now, I mean, they're very heavily influenced by Hollywood. Very much big, complex, powerful stories, usually with very over the top, exaggerated serial killers and serial killings. And I don't always find those hugely realistic. I've used serial killers once or twice in my crime novels. Um, I mean, there have been serial killers in Scotland in reality, in history, but not that many. We're a small country. And certainly when you go to Iceland or Norway, uh, as a real tourist, you're not going to come across much crime. Only in the pages of books will you come across a lot of crime. But again, they're using crime to say things about their society, to say things about the way society is organized, the way politics operates and has an influence over people, and how poverty and want and need can
Yeah.
turn people to crime.
Yes, that's true. They are really influenced by Hollywood, or want to be. Uh, they want, maybe they want films made from their books. Who knows?
I think so. I think a lot of them are they're written to be filmed. Written to be filmed. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's true.
yeah,
And I've never had much success with that. So maybe I'm just very jealous of these Scandinavian crime writers and their Hollywood movies. I don't think there'll ever be a Hollywood movie made of a Rebus novel. They're more. My books are more, I think, character driven. I'm much more
but you don't
interested
have
in.
with
Yeah,
John
I've had
Hannah
television series. Yeah, I mean, there have been TV shows made of my books, but they've not been
yeah,
hugely successful because they've been shortened to 1 hour or 1 hour
yeah,
and 30 minutes for one book, and so they basically get rid of all the good things in the books and just leave the central plot. And so the nuance and the theme, character development, there's no room for that in 1 hour. It's why I love the novel. I've loved writing a series where I've allowed my character Rebus to get old, and
yeah.
that,
Real time.
that in real time. So he's now no longer a detective. He's now retired. He's in his late 60s, and he's got health issues. He's got health problems, and I enjoy that. I enjoy the fact that I've been able to live with this guy through a large period of his adult life, from the age of 40, which he was in the first book, up to his
Yeah,
late 60s. And I think that has kept the books fairly realistic. And I think it's also kept him an interesting character for me to write about, because when I sit down to write a new book, he's changed. He's got older and his health has changed, and he's maybe no longer a detective, and he doesn't understand the world of police anymore. He doesn't understand the new technology that's around. And so that gives me challenges as an author, but I love the challenge. I just love the fact that I have to think hard about what kind of person has he become in the year between the previous book and the book that I'm
yeah,
writing now. And sometimes in crime fiction, your Poirots, although Poirot did get older slowly, Sherlock Holmes never really got old in the Sherlock Holmes books, and these detectives never seemed to be changed by the cases they had investigated. Whereas if you're a real life detective, if you're a real life cop, of course the job that you do has an impact on you. It changes you,
yeah,
and you learn from these cases, and you carry all these cases around with you in your head. And I didn't feel that the classic crime novel allowed for that to happen in the same way that it can happen in the Rebus novels, where he has all these ghosts in his head of all the victims of the crimes he's investigated. And he's got a sense of all the people all the crimes he didn't solve also are frustrating to him, and he carries them around with him as well.
Yeah, yeah. He moved with them in big cartons. His cold case files.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes, he's got a bedroom. He's got a bedroom in his apartment, and in that bedroom, he keeps all these boxes full of old unsolved cases, which he probably shouldn't have been allowed to take away from the police station when he retired.
yeah,
But he did. When I was a young writer, I became friendly with a detective in Edinburgh, and he would bring me boxes of case notes from solved murder investigations, so that I could get a sense of what actually happens during a police inquiry. And he was very useful to me in the early days of my detective stories. He would introduce me to lawyers and to pathologists and to other cops. And so I got a network of professionals who could help me with the research. So the books did slowly become more realistic because of that. Um, and I was very grateful to him. He's long retired. All the
and
contacts that I had in the police and the pathology department and everywhere else are now retired, and I have very few contacts left. I'm getting old. I'm getting old. Uh, so the detectives and the cops that I spend time with now when I go to the pub are talking about the 1980s and the 1990s. They're all retired.
yeah. So how did this shift take place? I mean, from the not golden age, but after that, Ruth Randall and P.D. James. How did
Mm.
the more hard-boiled thing take place as we came to Rebus?
I think what happened was we had P.D. James, we had Ruth Rendell, we had Reginald Hill and Colin Dexter in the UK writing crime novels that were not gritty. I mean, they were urban. Some of them were set in London, but they weren't as gritty as the stuff that was being written in America. And what happened was a group of writers came along, younger writers, who were more attracted to the American model of crime fiction. They wanted to write about contemporary Britain. They wanted to write about the problems that were happening in contemporary Britain. And so they were going to set their books in the cities, and they were going to set their books in cities that had problems. So we wanted to write about unemployment and prostitution and drugs and violence. And we had the American model, the American writers who were doing that, people like James Elroy that I've talked about. And so we started writing these books, and it was a movement. It was a move away from the books of that classic English period. Um, and at the same time, we looked to television and we looked to movies, and they had become more urban and more gritty, to our minds, more realistic about how the police operate, what the
Yeah,
police do and can't do. And so, yeah, I think it was the influence of America and the influence of television and film that changed the kinds of writers who came along. Mostly, I would say, in the 70s and 80s. It was happening in the 1970s, but they weren't really selling well until the 80s. And none of us became bestsellers until the 1990s, really. My generation of crime writers didn't really become bestsellers until the 90s. So yeah, it was a subtle change, and I always enjoyed. I did events, festivals with P.D. James and Ruth Rendell and Colin
they're good
Dexter,
writing.
and they were great fun. They were great fun, and they weren't disappointed or snobby about the fact that younger writers were coming along who wanted a big audience and were going to write books that were perhaps using serial killers and more bloody, more violent on the page. than the previous generation. They felt
Well,
that, you know, in crime fiction, there's room for everything. There's room for the soft-boiled. There's room for the hard-boiled. We were all doing the same thing. We were all in our different ways, writing about good and evil, and writing about human nature, and what makes good people do bad things. It comes back to Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment. It comes back to Jekyll and Hyde. Always, always, always.
yeah.
And these are not thought of as crime novels. And it comes back to Bleak House. Bleak House, which you talked about at the beginning, but I've not talked about much, is a terrific novel about England at a specific time in history. It's a great novel about London. It's a great novel about people who are very wealthy and are at the top of society, and how they interact with people lower down the ladder of class until you get to the very bottom, where people have nothing. And it's a great mystery story. There's a murder in it. There are also several mysteries in it. There's a huge legal case in the middle of it. So it's also a great novel about the courtroom and about the legal fraternity. It's a novel about politics. It contains multitudes. It's a phenomenal book. And, you know, that's the kind of book that I think most crime writers aspire to write, a novel that will tell us about human nature and tell us about the society we live in, the mess that we are in as a culture or in the human race, and maybe how we can escape it or how we can make things better. And I don't think crime fiction necessarily gives us the answers, but it allows us to keep investigating the question. I've got some quotes from writers that I keep pinned up on my notice board here in my office. And one of them says, the greatness of the novel is not in the answers it gives, but the questions it asks. And I've got another line from the novelist Iris Murdoch, and she says, every novel is the wreckage of a perfect idea. So when you're planning your book, it's always going to be the great novel. It's always going to be the greatest novel ever written. And it's going to say exactly what you want to say about the state of society. And then when you start writing it, it gets slippery. And you never quite say the thing you wanted to say in the first place. So you have to start again.
Shall we take some questions?
Yes, of course. Do we have questions?
Do you have them, or shall I read them?
I don't know. I don't have any.
Okay, I will read. I have three of them. I will read the first one. Crime is universal, yes. But is it possible to talk about something like a national style or regional? Is there any type of committing crime, say, in Scottish way, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I think if and I apologize. I'm sure there are Turkish crime novels. I've just not read any of them. Maybe they've not been translated yet, or maybe they've just they've not arrived in my office. But I'm sure that a novel that was written in Turkey about contemporary Turkey would be very different from a crime novel being written just now in the UK or America or anywhere else, India or China or Australia. Because it would be fashioned from the experiences of the novelist. And the experiences of a novelist in Turkey are going to be different from a novelist in the UK. So the politics would be different. The way the police operate would be different. The attitude of members of the public to the police would be different. And the day-to-day lives would be different. The way people make their living, what they have for dinner, what they drink, how they interact with their neighbours, these would all be different. And when we look at the Scandinavian crime writers, you're reading about a very different society, a very different culture, and a very different philosophy of life from other cultures. So reading about Turkey, you'd be reading about a different philosophy of life, the way that people go about their business and think about their neighbours and their family and their friends, and the potential their country has. Where do you see your country going in the future? I've just been introduced recently to Romanian crime fiction coming from Romania, and that has introduced me to Romanian politics, the movement to democracy that has happened in recent years, which is still quite a fragile thing in Romania. So that movement from autocracy to democracy is very interesting. And crime fiction is very good at teaching the reader about the recent political movements. Now, I know there's been a lot of unrest in Turkey recently, and I know that just outside the borders of Turkey, there are lots of things happening, lots of tensions, lots of political tensions and social tensions. And again, I would learn a lot about those from reading about them from a Turkish perspective. And those are things that are available to the Turkish writer that are not available to me writing about Scotland. So I can write about Scottish politics, I can write about Brexit, I can write about the movement towards independence from between Scotland and the UK. These are all things I can write about, but I can't write about the Turkish experience.
Well, the second one is almost similar to this. Do countries' cultures play a role in crime?
I think cultures do play a role in crime. And I mean, just to extend what I've been talking about a little bit, I would like to read
Yeah,
about contemporary China. I would like to read what's happening in China. And I think the crime novel would be a good way of doing that. But I'm very aware that writers in China, specifically crime writers, have to be very careful what they write about. Otherwise, they can get in trouble with the state. It's the same in Hong Kong. Hong Kong has been going through a huge upheaval with the student
yeah,
protests and democracy protests. There are crime writers writing about the present state of events in Hong Kong, but again, they've got to be careful. We've seen it. We've seen publishers and booksellers imprisoned,
yeah.
taken to China to be taken to court. And so, in some cultures, they're not as open. And maybe we shouldn't talk about Turkey, but I know that there is a situation in Turkey as well with writers that sometimes you have to be a little bit careful what you say.
Yes,
Um,
there's that.
and I'm very privileged that in the UK at the moment we can still say what we want to say. But my latest book, part of the theme of my latest book, is to do with the rise, specifically of the far right, in some cultures in Europe and elsewhere, and where that might lead. So in this book, I write about internment camps, which used to exist
Yeah,
in the United Kingdom during World War II, when we would not only lock up prisoners of war, but we would lock up people who were from a different culture. So if you were Italian or German or Chinese or Japanese, you might find yourself put in an internment camp in the UK. And there were over 1,000 of these camps. And I used those camps at that time as a way of talking about where the world might be headed if we're not very careful in the 21st century, which is heading back towards a period of isolationism for some countries, a period where we've got very polarized political views between the far right and the far left. We've got a media that we don't trust anymore, and that can lead us down a very dark path. And we're being told not to trust our neighbours. I mean, Brexit is predicated on the fact that British people are different from their neighbours in
yeah.
Europe, and we aren't. We're not different, and it's led to some very ugly scenes and some very ugly philosophies raising their heads again that some of us thought we had lost forever after World War II or after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. And suddenly these philosophies are with us again. They never went away. They just sat quietly under a rock and waited
Yeah.
for people to come along and start shouting about them again. So this is a very long answer. I'm sorry, it's a very long answer.
Yeah, yeah,
But I do think that crime fiction and the thriller can tell us a lot about the politics and the culture of our own countries and other countries. It can maybe lead us to a better understanding of why we are in a bit of a mess at the moment.
and there's a third one, an interesting question, in fact. stay-at-home orders have changed crime in real life. Will pandemic change crime fiction in time? What does Ian think about this?
It's a good question. During the pandemic was very good for me in some ways because I had nothing to do except write books. And
Same
normally
here.
I write one book every 2 years. This year I've already written two books, and I'm starting to think of writing a third. So I've got a lot of writing done because no tours, no festivals, no interruptions. Just me
No,
in
no.
this room writing. So it's been good. Would I write about the pandemic? Maybe not. But during the pandemic, I was asked by the National Theatre of Scotland if I would write a 10-minute monologue to put for an actor to read. And I decided to write about Rebus in lockdown.
Yeah,
So Rebus during the pandemic. And it's online,
yeah,
you can see it on YouTube. And the actor, a very good actor called Brian Cox, played Rebus. And so that was me saying what I wanted to say about the pandemic. I don't feel the need to write about it any other way. And I think from the pandemic, there will be a lot of novels. There will be a lot of novels. But I think the crime novel is at its best when it's discussing events that happened after, a long time afterwards or sometime after they've happened. I'll give you a good example of that. During the crisis, the violence in Northern Ireland, there was no crime fiction or almost no crime fiction being written. They didn't need it. They were living through a period of great violence. When the peace process happened, slowly people began to write crime novels about Ireland to explain the situation. And I think we should let the pandemic die down, give it a year or two, and then when the dust has settled, we can
yeah.
maybe write good novels about the pandemic. I mean, the backdrop of Edinburgh is to anybody who follows me on Twitter in Turkey will have seen my photographs. Walking through the streets of Edinburgh during the lockdown was extraordinary. It was, usually in the summer, it's full of tourists, it's bustling and noisy, the festivals are all happening. It was
Yeah.
completely empty. And it would make a really good backdrop for a crime novel, but I don't think I'm ever going to write it. I think other novelists will write pandemic novels. I think I've said everything I want to say about it.
Okay, we have one last question. Being an author, giving high importance to being realistic and building real characters, what does Ian think about domestic noir? Introducing ordinary characters who solve cases.
Well, I mean, it can be believable. Of course, it can be believable. I think the rise of domestic noir is really interesting because it's written by people who I think don't want to write about cops because they have very complicated feelings about police detectives. And I think anyone who writes about a police detective now has to think really hard because we're being shown on the media over and over again that the cops are not necessarily the good guys. The police officers who are beating up black people in America, who are
Yeah,
confronting demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators, who are just a couple of days ago in France going into a music producer's home and beating him up and
yeah.
captured on video. So now there are riots in France because of that. We're being shown over and over again that the cops are not necessarily the good guys. And so if you can write crime fiction with no detectives, no cops, you don't have to deal with that issue. You don't have to deal with that problem. Um, and a lot of these are great stories. They're really gripping narratives, domestic noir. And a lot of crime in the real world is domestic crime. It's crime committed by people you know, usually against you. So things like spousal abuse, people beating up their partners, or using psychological torture, psychological beatings, as it were, on their partner. We know this goes on. And a lot of what the police have to deal with these days on a day to day basis is to do with relationships breaking down. And so, yeah, a lot of that you can cover realistically in domestic noir without involving cops, or the cops can be secondary characters. It's really, you're really focusing on the social issue, and therefore you're focusing on the people who are undergoing this problem, who are suffering this problem, and the detectives don't need to be involved at all for you to deal with that issue. And we've had a lot of unreliable narrators, usually female main characters who are maybe alcoholic, so they have blackouts. We can't always trust their account of things. Girl on a Train, good example of that. Where we can't always, there's a lot of unreliable narrators, which is really interesting. My books are usually a lot more linear. You can trust what Rebus tells you, but you can't always trust what people are telling you in a lot of these domestic noir novels. And usually there's a great twist. The thing I like in domestic noir is usually halfway through or 2/3 of the way through the book, there's a really great twist that you didn't see coming. And as a novelist, I then have to go back to the beginning of the book to see if I should have. How did they do that? How did they do that twist? As a practitioner, I can learn a lot from these writers.
Okay then. Thank you very much, Ian Rankin. We are happy and honored to have you in the Black Week. And I just hope that if things change somewhat, at least, you'll come back live and we'll have a live interview in Istanbul in the near future.
I hope so. I hope so. And thank you very much to everybody in Turkey for watching and for reading the books. And Seven, thank you very much for your questions. You, as always, you're a very good interviewer. Thank you.
You helped me.
We say bye now.
Bye.